It's rather exciting. This feels like season 2 now, but we've moved on from Genesis and this is now the start of the book of Exodus. This follows on from the end of Genesis in that when we finished that story, the Israelites were all in Egypt. They were being fruitful, obviously. And this then picks up where the numbers of the Israelites / Hebrews, they're expanding in number. The generations of, over time, the Pharaoh who liked them is obviously gone. And the reason for them being there seems to have gotten a little bit lost. So the Egyptians are not particularly pleased with all the Israelites in Egypt. The plan to deal with this, cunningly, is to enslave them, which seems like a slightly terrible idea. If there's a lot of them, then enslaving them would seem like a difficult task, but nevertheless they do this. Eventually we get to a Pharaoh who just says, actually I've got a better idea. What we're going to do is any boy Hebrews, Israelites born, we're going to chuck them in the River Nile. Any girls, fine, they can just carry on as they were. This brings us up to Moses, which seems to be somewhere around 250 to 400 years after the death of Joseph. And Moses is born at a time where he's supposed to be born flung in a river. Technically, he does end up in the river, the Nile, obviously. But his mother puts him in a basket that she can then float him down the river. The Pharaoh's daughter is then said to have come down to the River Nile to bathe and finds baby Moses in his Moses basket and feels sorry for him, it says, and then gets one of her slaves to look after him. And then as he grows up and presumably nappies are out of the way and terrible twos and all the rest of it, decides to make her his son. So oddly, having been born Hebrew / Israelite, he ends up part of the royal family in Egypt. The story from there just skips ahead until Moses is grown up, and it's said that he's down among his people, the Hebrew / Israelites. I need to pick one, don't I? I'm going to go Hebrews because that's what it says in the Bible, but it's then going to get confusing when it's the Israelites who are leaving, but it's the same, I think. This Egyptian chap is beating up a couple of Hebrew people. So Moses goes down there and kills him because it's the Bible, so that's, you're out for a stroll in the afternoon, you go and kill someone. To be fair, it does seem somewhat righteous in this instance. Pharaoh finds out, Moses has to leg it because he's now in trouble, and off we go. Next, we're on to Moses up a mountain one day, and we have the burning bush. Interestingly, it says that this bush is on fire, but it makes the point of saying that the bush is not actually being consumed by the fire. So it's not like we can say that it got struck by lightning, there's just a bush on fire. It seems that this is quite a special fire. Then a voice comes out of it, which I guess is also somewhat special. And it's God saying Moses needs to go back to Egypt to lead the Israelites, because they're definitely now referred to as Israelites, out of Egypt. So just to recap that, back with Joseph and Jacob, who was also known as Israel, the whole move was to go into Egypt and then multiply and be fruitful. That's happened for about 400 years, and now it's time to leave because the Israelites are being oppressed by the Egyptians. It's very interesting that God clearly knows that the Pharaoh is not going to let them go. So he's saying to Moses, go back, see the Pharaoh, say you want your people back. He's saying the Pharaoh is going to say no. And then God says he's going to stretch out with his hand and strike the Egyptians with wonders. And at that point, post-wonders, the Pharaoh will let them go. Part of this conversation is that Moses asked God his name. The answer, it seems, is I am who I am. Delightfully cryptic, but I just difficult to know what to do with that. I don't think that he's suggesting that's his name. I think that is a straightforward, I can't be defined or something like that. I just found that interesting, and that's how that God chose to answer that question. Moses is worried that no one's going to believe him, so God gives him some sort of minor miracles he can perform to prove that he's got a higher power behind him. He says to Moses, take his staff and throw it on the floor, and he does, and then it turns immediately into a snake, and then he's told to pick it up by the tail, and then it turns back into a staff. Then he's given 2 more sort of backup tricks in case no one believes that. You can turn a stick into a snake. That's pretty convincing, I think. But a backup one that you can turn skin into some sort of skin disease, then turn it back to normal again. And then another one where you can take a cup of water from the Nile, tip it on the ground, and as it hits the ground, it will turn into blood. but it's still a little dark, isn't it? So a particularly interesting part of this, which stumped me for a little while, and I think I'm still stumped on it, is that God says, go back and see the Pharaoh, then do your demonstration of tricks, as it were, for want of a better word, to prove that you are acting on my behalf. And I will harden the Pharaoh's heart. And I sort of thought that was going to be a translation issue. And it was actually that the Pharaoh will harden his own heart. And I assume by that meaning that he's basically just telling Moses to sod off. But I checked that there's an app where you can check lots of different translations of Bible passages. And nearly all of them seem to say that God is saying that he will harden the Pharaoh's heart. And it begs the obvious question of why, because it'd be much easier if Moses went, throw a stick on the floor, turns into a snake. Pharaoh presumably would be somewhat taken aback by this and go, okay, yeah, perhaps there's something going on in here, I better let these people go. It seems God doesn't want that. He wants to drop his wonders, as he's put it, he's going to strike the Egyptians with wonders. Actually wants to unleash those. Finally, there's one really, really weird bit in here. I had to read this several times, and I even debated just leaving this out because it doesn't seem to move the story at all. But it's so odd. I thought I'm going to put it in. But it's Moses is on his way to Egypt, having had the conversation with God and said, "Yep, fine, we're going." And it's saying that God was going to kill him. It's not clear why. Maybe fed up with all his objections and all the rest of it. So God's about to kill Moses, who's on his way to Egypt to do what he was told to do, which is not a pleasant job, certainly. And then it said that his wife takes a flint, circumcises her and Moses' son, takes the byproduct of said event, touches it on Moses' foot, and then God just leaves him alone. And nothing more is said about it after that. It is very, very odd. I've had to read that a few times. Am I just missing something? Well, clearly I'm missing something, but we come back to that if that becomes relevant anyway. But yes, clearly Moses was about to meet his end and was saved by the most odd of acts. And perhaps there's something cultural in that, I'm sure, but even so, that's a little odd. There's also a part where God explicitly says via Moses that he's to go to the Pharaoh and threaten or tell him that he's going to kill the Pharaoh's firstborn son. And it's an interesting way to open negotiations. It's clearly going on with a very hostile and combative attitude towards taking on the Pharaoh. God is clearly not approaching this in any sort of save his soul or try and negotiate this peacefully. This is proper heads down, this is war sort of territory. In terms of what to do with all that, and obviously we've got a big part of the story moving on. So we've had the Israelites going into Egypt and being fruitful. Now we've got the start of the Israelites coming back out of Egypt. I think it's, in that respect, it's clearly supposed to be narration and therefore literal. A burning bush is an interesting one. It's also interesting that I believe Moses wrote the book of Exodus as well as he wrote Genesis. But he's referring to himself in the third person, obviously, so it's not obvious from reading it that he wrote it. That's only something I've found out elsewhere from Googling. I think in terms of narration versus metaphor, this would seem more narration, so we'll just wait and see what comes from it. Given that Moses is writing about himself, and therefore not writing about the origins of the universe that he wasn't there for, presumably from here on in we're talking narration. So I think I'll stop doing the question of whether it's something's metaphorical or literal, unless it seems obviously metaphorical. I think from there it's just a setup of a very interesting story. So it's clearly a worthy sequel to Genesis so far, and we'll just have to read on a bit and see what comes out and see if it makes any sense. But on for the next video, that will be the plagues of Egypt.